Croeso I bawb sydd yn gwylio. Fy enw yw Elfyn Llwyd ac fe gefais i'r fraint o gadeirio Comisiwn Annibyniaeth Plaid Cymru yn hyd â comisiynwyr eraill wrth reswm. Mi wna I gyflwyno y panelwyr sef o fi yn nes ymlaen. Welcome to you all. My name is Elfyn Llwyd and I've been given the privilege of chairing Plaid Cymru's Independence Commission. This commission was tasked with making recommendations on how an incoming Plaid Cymru government should prepare a route towards a referendum on independence in Wales. Our anticipation is that that referendum could take place somewhere in the next 10 years or so. And evidently, a lot of work has been done on many difficult questions hitherto. They have been difficult. For example, on the economics of independence, on sovereignty, and various other aspects. Broadly speaking, we have looked at Wales's relationship with the other nations of the UK and how that is rapidly developing and needs to develop. We have looked at Wales's place within Europe, albeit post-Brexit. We have looked at the need for a constitution for Wales, driven by the views of the Welsh people, of course. We have suggested the drawing up of a self-determination bill by the incoming government. And crucially, a great deal of work has been done on what is known as the fiscal gap, the economics of independence. And we've been hugely assisted in that regard by 2 or 3 eminent economists. Underpinning this, of course, is the need already highlighted some time ago for the economy to be boosted by way of better assistance for small and medium-sized sectors, high-quality jobs, a proper export policy, and an economic policy to suit the needs of Wales, rather than being dictated always by the needs of the South East and London, who have prospered over many, many years and continue to do so, but unfortunately at a cost to other parts and other nations within the UK. And so there are other chapters, of course, and we make several recommendations in each field of policy, which we hope will assist in informing the people of Wales in advance of any proposed referendum on independence. There are extremely important questions to be asked, but we are able now at least to produce answers to many of them. We don't say that the answers are definitive, but we do feed in to this conversation, a conversation which we believe has become even more crucial in these difficult times. With those introductory words, I will just further elucidate some of the points that we have made and a summary of the main parts of this particular work. We believe that there should be a separate jurisdiction. I mentioned that. It's a curiosity, really, that we have our own legislature, but we do not have our own legal framework. And I think I'm right in saying we may be the only country in the world, if not the only one or two, in this particular situation. It is a strange situation, given that Welsh laws diverge constantly from those applying to England and Wales, especially, for example, in environmental law, in family law, and constitutional law, and many other branches of law. They're already diverging. So therefore, it's a question of not if we need a Welsh jurisdiction, it's when. We do recommend, ahead of any referendum on national independence, that there should be a national commission and citizens' assemblies in Wales to ensure maximum awareness, participation and involvement of the public. We should test the views sometime in the next 5 or 10 years by way of a referendum. And we believe that this commission, the National Commission which will be set up, should draft a Welsh Constitution. Now, in our report, we have drafted a form of Welsh Constitution and referred to some important parts of it in terms of diversity, inclusion, making sure citizens' assemblies have their input, and crucially, that it's all based on sustainability. And despite Wales voting to leave Europe in 2016, we believe that Wales should retain a very close working relationship with our friends and colleagues in Europe. We believe that it is a way forward by applying to EFTA. There are ways that we could ease the way back into the European Union in due course, if that is the will of the people of Wales. It happens to be the Commission's view, but of course this would have to be tested in due course. But Brexit as it stands does raise some very, very serious problems for Wales, its economy, and obviously its citizens. We believe that there are some practical challenges to becoming a full member again of the European Union, but these could be, in due course, could be overcome by the potential for Wales joining separately from England, joining the European Free Trade Area, which would enable Wales to trade equally with our partners, our friends on the European Union, though not being a full member of the European Union. If in due course the people of Wales decide that it is their wish to rejoin the European Union, then so be it. There are the way forward through EFTA would be a step forward in that particular direction. Now, as regards the economy of Wales, there have been for many, many years structural weaknesses which in effect have been imposed upon Wales for quite a long time. The challenges have been there for many years. We make some recommendations, and my colleagues will address that in due course. We make certain recommendations which will assist in bringing forth a booming economy to Wales in due course. There have been decades, if not generations, of underperforming, and I've already alluded briefly to this. It's, in our view, partly to do with the fact that there has not been a true economic policy which fits Wales, which fits the northwest of England, for example, the northeast, Scotland, but seems to be perfectly fine for the southeast of England and London. And you could say good luck to them. Yes, good luck to them, but not at a cost to the other parts of the current setup. We believe that we could be in a position to deliver prosperity to Wales. We have looked at some examples, one of them being the Irish example, which went from a peripheral and rather poor part of the UK, now a confident, self-assured, independent nation, one of the richest parts of these isles collectively, and with a seat on the United Nations. It is our belief that we should be looking at agencies to promote small business growth, medium-sized business development, inward investment, productivity and export activity. The focus on inward investment should be on businesses that are capable of offering high-quality jobs in technology, health, and sophisticated consumer-facing products. We believe also that contact should be deepened with alumni of Welsh universities based overseas. And in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, greater emphasis on local production and procurement is also key, we think. By the way, the notion of closer contact with alumni is something which has proven very successful in the Irish economy for 20 years or so now, and they are way ahead of the curve in that aspect. It's something that we could confidently do here in Wales as well. And we believe that an incoming Welsh government should review the entire Welsh higher education sector in order to ensure that this meets the needs of the Welsh economy and society. And this is, we believe, a huge priority. And we believe it should set in motion measures to encourage more Welsh students to stay in Wales if they choose to do so, and to pursue their careers in Wales without having to feel that they need to leave in order to make a decent living. We also say there should be more collective ways of moving forward. We say that we should concentrate on the Welsh economy. We should concentrate on ways in which we can offer a real and promising and bright future to the people of Wales. And we do not see this as being part of the current United Kingdom setup, because for decades past it has failed and it has left us in a weak position. But it is a weak position from which we can recover. And it is a weak position from which we are going to recover, and which has been the subject of a huge amount of work by eminent economists on the Commission. And may I say, we took evidence from people from outside of Plaid Cymru, from people who aren't necessarily that well disposed towards the party even, but it's based upon their good sense and their researches that we come to the various conclusions. And in that regard, we were extremely well served by Dr. Eirfil ap Gwilym, and also extremely well assisted by Rhys, a well-known economic commentator and former Financial Times journalist, who is a commissioner and who I'm delighted to say sits to my right and will be concentrating more perhaps on the economic side of our arguments in due course, and he'll give you a flavour of what is included within the report that's been published today. Rhys.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Elfyn. Thank you very much. Whenever this subject is broached, the argument that always comes up is, can Wales afford it? That always seems to be the clincher. And indeed, today we've seen the Liberal Democrats in Wales, even before the report is published, playing that particular card. And I would say even before they've had the chance to read it. But I think the other way of looking at this is, can Wales afford not to? We have to accept that our place within the UK has been diminishing over recent years. We don't have as big a shout in Britain as we used to. We're less integrated into the key sectors of the UK economy than we used to be when Welsh coal, Welsh steel, out of Welsh industrial production was an integral part of what Britain was manufacturing. And we've seen even today another leg of the Welsh industrial economy disappear, with Ford finally closing its plant in Bridgend. Ford, in that case, following many other multinational companies that have upped sticks from Wales in the last couple of decades. We're becoming more dependent on the rest of the British economy to provide us with the level of services which we get in Wales. And we have to draw the conclusion that we are possibly now rather locked into the wrong kind of economy. And particularly with Scotland possibly going independent as well, and a lot sooner than Wales might do so, we face the prospect that, as Cynog Davies suggested a little while ago, we could end up being the sort of backyard of England, a sort of grander Cornwall. And I think that's not a fate that people in Wales would wish to aspire to. The reasons for our current state go back several decades to the 1980s, when the British government of the day, under the thinking of Sir Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher's Trade Secretary, was that we should have a different kind of regional policy. In fact, not very much of a regional policy at all, but a policy of trickle down. The idea was that you allowed London to overheat, and then jobs would overspill into the rest of the British economy. So instead of having all the various measures that used to exist, that would be the way of encouraging growth around the country. But of course, instead of allowing London to overheat, the British government over the last couple of decades, both Labour and Conservative, have continued to plough money into supporting the London economy with a vast number of projects, very, very expensive, running into hundreds of billions on railway projects for London. And the result has been that instead of London being able to contribute jobs and services to the rest of the economy, what has happened is that London's reach has been greatly extended, so that now you can commute into London from Southampton, Swindon, Peterborough. London has increased its footprint to cover roughly a quarter of the British state. And as a result, we are feeding a London economy that has concentrated heavily on financial services, tourist services, and we've neglected to maintain the level of manufacturing and the type of products that many of our competitor countries in Europe still manage to produce. So we've become a very singular kind of economy in Britain, with much of our activity concentrated in and around the London area. And it has to be said that the Welsh Government, the UK Government, the EU, they haven't really had any idea of a proper focused approach to how to restore the regions of Britain to the former prosperity that they always used to enjoy. Now, of course, this is the famous levelling up agenda, which has now become such a prominent topic. We've talked about it a lot. Lord Heseltine used to be very keen on it. Lord Kerslake, a former senior civil servant, wrote a report, UK 2070, which highlighted these problems. So we're well aware of them in Britain, but there's not much evidence that governments have put into practice the good intentions that they continually offer. In fact, as far as we can see, the present government's levelling up agenda consists of not much more than HS2, more investment in Trans-Pennine railways, more spending on housing, but no idea of the sort of structure of the economy that would suit the whole of Britain. And if people think that HS2 is going to benefit the North or even the Midlands or certainly North Wales, as is sometimes suggested, they should think again, because inevitably what will happen will be that once you've connected London to Birmingham by a very, very fast railway line, businesses in London will find it easier to service Birmingham from London rather than move their operations there to serve their activities in London from Birmingham. So the crucial question is, how could independence solve this? How can we make the sums add up? Because we all know that Wales is heavily dependent on transfers from the rest of the United Kingdom. Not unlike other regions, only London, the South East and East Anglia actually have more revenue than spending. Wales is no different from the North East, Scotland, Northern Ireland, although it is one of the most heavily subsidised. But how do we go on in an independent situation to afford the level of services that we now have? How do we close the famous fiscal gap? Well, I think as Elfyn alluded, we're not talking about independence tomorrow, when clearly there would be quite a shock to the system in Wales. To quote the famous phrase which Ron Davies will always be associated with, independence is a process, not an event. And so stage one, as Elfyn highlighted, is an attempt to create a radically different economic programme for Wales and to deal with those structural weaknesses. External ownership and management. We all know that most businesses in Wales are not owned and controlled in Wales. We have had a lot of good, new, interesting Welsh businesses over the last couple of decades, But by and large, command and control of the Welsh economy is outside the hands of Welsh people. We also have a tendency for our businesses, even when they do start up and develop, to become the subject of takeover from businesses in Britain, Europe or the United States, so that we have become very much a feeder economy in Wales. And we all know what happens to feeder clubs. They never get to the top of the Premier League. They always stay in League Division 1 and 2. So we're very vulnerable to just that kind of takeover. And in some cases, we actually encourage it. Organisations like the Development Bank of Wales do a very good job. But when they invest in a company, they're very often looking for an exit. And the way to get an exit is to sell on to somebody else. So we're suggesting measures that would enable businesses to stay in Wales and to grow in Wales. And we feel that the Welsh state needs to be much more closely involved in seeking to encourage that. The other thing that we need to do in Wales is to do something about our low export propensity. We need to get our firms, big and small and medium-sized, exporting to a much greater extent. You can look at Welsh export figures and see, gosh, this is encouraging. We export more to the EU than Britain generally. But our export proportions, while they might be significant in terms of going into the EU, nevertheless, if you look more closely at these figures, you'll see that the overwhelming bulk of these exports are actually in the transport sector, engines from Bridgend, which we won't have anymore, wings from Airbus, and also a lot of energy exports. Our figures in relation to Ireland are very, very poor. They export 10 times as much from Ireland as we do. And the modest exports we have to Ireland, 2/3 of those are actually petroleum and oil products. So it's into Milford Haven, quick turnaround, back out on a ship to Ireland. So we have very, very poor exports in Wales, whatever the figures might suggest. And that's an area that needs much, much more concentrated attention. Now, Elfyn mentioned some of the other things that we need to do to improve our economy, and I won't go through those. But what it all will require is other structural changes. A lot of people have examined the Welsh civil service over recent years and come to the conclusion that it is not sufficiently policy-driven and not sufficiently delivery-driven. We have inherited a civil service which still thinks of itself as a branch of Whitehall. So we do need to have a complete new way of thinking in the Welsh civil service. And it needs to look at what they do in Scotland, where they have a much more active policy-driven approach than we have ever managed to achieve here in Wales, where the approach has almost entirely been a managerial one. Another factor in Wales's poor performance has been the lack of synchronisation within our government departments here in Wales. Again, people who've been seconded to work in the Welsh service, in Welsh government departments, have come away very often amazed at the extent to which they operate completely in silos. We need a much more cooperative, joint planning approach within our Welsh government departments and on the part of ministers. And we also need to recover the situation we once had when the Welsh Development Agency was in operation. Now, the arguments over the WDA have gone on for a very long time, and no doubt there were reasons why it was appropriate at the time to look again. But I think it's only now the Welsh government in Cardiff Bay, the Labour Welsh government, that believes that not having a proper development agency is a good thing, and that the use of effectively civil service arms to carry out that type of approach will be sufficient. Yet if you look at what other countries are doing, then you'll see that we really are just not in this game at all anymore. The Irish, I was amazed to discover, through their IDA, have branches all around the world, and in some cases multiple branches in the same country. They have three operations in California alone, as well as in places like Sydney, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore. They are represented all around the world where we just are not in Wales. So this is a real impediment to us securing the type of new investment and in generating increased interest in Wales. So as a recent report suggested, we do need to restore the situation where we have an arm's length agency working for Wales. There's also a need for an expanded role for the Development Bank, which actually has a very low ceiling on the funding that it's able to offer to Welsh businesses. We need to get close to the venture capital sector and to private equity to make sure that we're bringing more funds into Wales from those sectors as well. And as Elfyn suggested, we need a more active procurement policy, and we need to see how we can grow more of our own produce in Wales rather than be reliant to such an extent on imports. And in this respect, we would be working with the grain of current thinking, because so many people now feel that the idea of importing fruit and vegetables from Spain, trucking them across Europe to bring them into Britain, is just not sustainable, not to mention other goods that are brought from even further afield. We do need, in Britain as a whole, to be catering for ourselves to a much greater extent. And why can't we in Wales take a lead in trying to do that? So these are all things that a new economic policy for Wales could instigate and which could lead to growth in the Welsh economy. But all of this would have to be underpinned by proper research. We don't have in Wales adequate research into the business and economic needs of Wales. We know an awful lot about the economy of Wales, exactly how many people have low incomes, household expenditure, etc. We don't know what are the business needs for a thriving Welsh economy. So with all these measures, I think we would hopefully over a period of a number of years raise the quality and the number of jobs. We would increase income levels within Wales, and because we would increase income levels, we would generate more revenue through taxes to pay for our services. So we could go quite a good way towards reducing that fiscal gap, the gap between the amount of money raised in Wales through taxes and the amount of money spent in Wales in the provision of public services. But critics are going to say, well, it's still a big gap that's going to be filled. We're well down the league table. Are you saying we can just, with a few measures, jump closer to the top? Well, the gap is large and can't be ignored, but we mustn't let it frighten us. There are other things that we could do in an independent Wales, which we don't have the freedom to do at the moment. On the income side, there are taxes that would be open to an independent Wales, which we're not currently able to raise. Just one example. If you think of road tax, that goes to central government, and no doubt a chunk of it comes back to Wales. But the roads of Wales are very extensively used to supply the Irish with a lot of their requirements. If we went to a road pricing system, such as they use on the Dartford Tunnel or for the London congestion charge, automatic number plate recognition, and you can capture the vehicles entering Wales and the vehicles leaving Wales. You can see how far they travelled, and you can tax them on that basis. So we would gain revenue from vehicles using Welsh roads, and also low users of motor vehicles would be able to pay less. There are energy taxes we could look at. There are a lot of pipelines and pylons across Wales. I don't think we get any benefit, as far as I can tell, from the oil pipelines or the gas pipelines that go from Pembrokeshire to Gloucestershire. There's a rent that could be obtained from that. If you look at our military bases, a lot of Breconshire, big chunks of Pembrokeshire, are used for military training. I don't suppose the Ministry of Defence pays anything other than normal council rates and taxes for those. So we could find a source of rent in activities such as that. So there are all sorts of things that we could look at as a way of raising extra revenue in Wales. Again, a lot will be made of the fact that we do have some figures now which show what's attributed to Wales and what's not. But these can be investigated, and it may well be that a lot of the costs that are attributed to Wales and a lot of the revenues that are supposedly generated in Wales are in the one case lower than we might think, and in the case of the revenues might be higher than we think. The economist Mark Barry has suggested that Wales is a little bit like the rather neglected subsidiary of a big corporation, where a lot of costs are loaded onto the subsidiary and a lot of the revenues it raises are attributed to headquarters. And as a result, you don't get a balanced picture of how that particular subsidiary operates. And that's the point at which people come in and say, why don't we have a management buyout? Because we, the managers of that subsidiary, think we know better how to run it. That's a little bit the situation that we're in Wales. And there are also other areas of expenditure which need to be looked at. We contribute to projects in England, HS2 for example, although we may get a chunk back of that in consequentials, but we contribute to projects that supposedly are going to benefit Britain and as a whole, but perhaps they don't. Perhaps if we weren't contributing to those, we would have a slightly smaller deficit on the expenditure side. So finally, the other thing that would make a difference is borrowing. We've heard today that the British government now has a public debt of something like £2 trillion. Countries do borrow to finance their expenditure, and there's no reason why an independent Wales, properly constituted, where rights of property were recognised, which enjoyed the rule of law, there's no reason why a country like that, a new Wales, couldn't borrow money in the money markets of the world to finance its expenditure. Obviously, it would have to be sustainable over the long term. We'd have to have a means of demonstrating that we were going to be able to maintain our debt repayments and pay the debt down. But borrowing is a possibility for any country in the world that has a proper status. So I think on the economy side of the equation, the trajectory that we're suggesting is this: a full reboot of the Welsh economy to boost employment and income in the sort of jobs that we think are appropriate for a modern European country, leading to a situation where a choice could ultimately be put to the Welsh people. Do you want an independent Wales with a better balanced economy, not just balanced as against Wales, England, Scotland and Ireland, but balanced within Wales, where prosperity is shared throughout Wales, as well as greater prosperity in relation to the rest of the United Kingdom? Do you want an economy that has different approaches to funding our needs, different approaches on social and other issues, which are more in tune with the way Welsh people have thought and felt over generations? An economy which is much more like successful European economies, the likes of Denmark or Norway, Finland, Ireland, etc. And not be an economy which has bet the bank on financial services and which really operates in such a way that the huge revenues and profits that come from financial services are used to ameliorate conditions in other less privileged parts of the country. And perhaps the other clincher on the other side of the argument is this: there was something like 60 members of the United Nations when it was formed at the end of the Second World War. There are now something like 180. And as far as I know, virtually all of those countries have decided that being a new country is no bad thing. Take places like Estonia. When it left the Soviet Union, it could have said, well, we're a small place, we speak a language very like Finnish, let's join Finland. But they didn't. Norway and Sweden have never reunited. The Czech Republic and Slovakia emerged out of Czechoslovakia. They don't want to get together again. Generally speaking, Being independent gives you a pride and a self-esteem. And that's what we're asking Welsh people to think about now and to decide whether that's the sort of future that they might like to consider. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Rhys. Before I pass over to my colleague Fflur, I should mention that the members of the Commission were Carys Aron, a businesswoman and lawyer, Eirfil ap Gwilym, who is an economics advisor to Plaid Cymru, Ellen ap Robert, an arts consultant and former artistic director of Gallery Caernarfon and Pontio Bangor, Cynnog Davies, former MP and AM for the Senedd's Mid and West Wales region, Rhys, we have already heard from, Jonathan Huish, Chief Executive of the Capital People consultancy firm, and Fflur Jones, who is a partner with the commercial law firm Darwin Gray here in Cardiff. Also Glyndwr Kenneth Jones, who's the Chief Executive of a UK-wide training body and also an education body. Menna Jones, the Chief Executive of Antur Wain Fawr, Dr Einir Young, Director of Sustainability at the University in Bangor. And in addition, the Commission was advised by two eminent Welsh lawyers, Keith Bush QC and Professor Thomas Watkin QC. Although we were tasked to begin in January, things were not easy given the COVID epidemic, but we did manage to have meetings with various people with huge expertise on a variety of constitutional, political, economic and financial aspects relating to independence, and these meetings were invaluable. Amongst the people we met with are Gito Ivan of the Cardiff University, Professor Jerry Holtham, Professor Jim Gallagher, Sir Adrian Webb, David Melding MS, Robin McAlpine, Howell Kerry-Evans, Charles Marquand, Mark Russell MSP, Professor Kevin Morgan and Dr David Tristan. We also met with representatives of Yes Cymru and on a couple of occasions with the House of Lords Constitutional Reform Group, which, if nothing else, underlines that this conversation is now timely. And I would like to ask Fflur, who I introduced as she's a well-known solicitor here in Cardiff and a partner in a commercial law firm, and she will address the question of where does this conversation go next. Fflur, diolch.
Diolch yn fawr, Elfyn. Thank you very much. Mae'n bleser cael bod yma heddiw yma ac wedi cael bod yn rhan o'r Comisiwn yn ystod y misoedd anodd dwytha yma. It's been a pleasure to be part of the Commission in these last difficult months, and it's been a good focus for us all instead of thinking of the effects of the pandemic. So I've been asked to come here today to discuss with you where should the conversation go now and how do we bring Wales with us. Lle ddyle'r sgwrs fynd rwan a sut mae dod â Chymru hefo ni de. The findings of the report itself are self-explanatory, and I'm sure all of you who are tuning in will be looking forward to the opportunity to read them. But obviously we need to think about how do we explain what is in this exciting report to the people of Wales, the citizens of Wales. And as far as we can see, there are two very important jobs that need to be done in order to achieve that. That's basically communication and engagement. We need to basically work now and focus ourselves on preparing Wales to be the world's next new country. I'll start with a quote by Robin McAlpine in his book, How to Start a New Country. He says, "An independent Wales cannot and must not belong to one government, one political movement, one political party. It is a common inheritance for all." So that's quite timely, isn't it, to think of it as something that belongs to the whole people of Wales, and why, therefore, we need to communicate this with the people of Wales. So the goal, as far as I can see, and as far as my fellow Commission members can see, is to exude confidence in the case for independence and provide everyone with a belief that an independent Wales is possible, desirable, and actually the only option. And as I've already said, this can only be done by virtue of communication with everyone and also engagement. Cyfathrebu ac ymgysylltu yn mynd I fod yn holl bwysig. Na I ddechrau efo cyfathrebu, I'll start with communication. Communication comes from the Latin word communicare, meaning to share. It's the act of conveying meaning or a message from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic rules. Engagement is another form of communication. It's ideally an effective two-way conversation between people, and it's not really a forum to persuade people. It's more something where views and ideas can be exchanged. There will be a need to convey a simple, clear, unambiguous and persuasive message that appeals to the hearts of all the citizens of Wales that we can have a kinder, fairer and happier future as an independent country. We have to appeal to all communities of Wales in all their wonderful and rich diversity. That has to be the key. In order for this to be successful, we will need to overcome some cognitive dissonance that exists in Wales. For example, questions such as, how can we, when we're so small and so poor and so dependent on our benevolent neighbour on whose taxes we rely, how do we address that? We will have to be able to address those kinds of questions. We need to build the confidence within the population that the voices of all people of Wales can be heard and must be heard. We have to communicate the stories that are in this report. There are very many good examples, like Rhys has mentioned earlier, of things where we can do things differently and imaginatively. And it's very important that we tell the people of Wales those stories. People outside the political sphere in the Wales and in fact across the UK are switched off by the adversarial stance of political parties, vying with each other for the high ground. But it's time really to change the tune, isn't it? And give people examples of independence so that they can understand and start to believe that it can lead to a better, fairer and healthier Wales. So one challenge, obviously, before we can start communicating is to identify the challenges that faces us. We must basically understand what barriers there are to some of these conversations that must happen. The main one that we perceive, and having gone through this exercise with the Commission and as a whole, is that we suffer from a lack of national self-confidence. There's an internal battle going on between hope and fear. And this lack of self-confidence basically favours fear. It's basically the case of better the devil we know. To overcome this, the questions we ask and the engagement process must be precise, clear and positive. The work of the Commission revealed the benefits also of looking at other regions. And in fact, we recommend that we need to broaden our horizons further, and a further piece of work should be commissioned to explore and identify countries of similar size to Wales who've become independent so we can learn from their experiences. There's also a piece of work to be done on the segmentation of audiences in Wales. We already know, obviously, that very many people support independence, the Plaid Cymru leadership, elected politicians, members and voters for the party. But to cement this support, Plaid Cymru itself, in our view, will need to make sure that it's communicating and engaging openly and often with all tiers of supporters to make them feel a valued part of a growing movement. The party should also conduct a 360-degree review of its own capacity and capabilities so they can strengthen its communications and messaging. There's also the category of the citizens of Wales who are not yet supporters. And I think a big focus has to be on gaining the next 10% of hardcore supporters to come along on this exciting journey. For example, the messages of the report should be communicated and discussed with Labour for Indie Wales. It's a group that's growing in number. Allegedly, there's around 40% of Labour voters. There's also people in the convergence areas, where in parts of Wales where the vote tends to go either to Plaid or Labour, and also there's a discussion to be had with those who live in what we call the non-convergence areas. And there's obviously the need to engage with every socio-economic group, which can be subdivided into Welsh speakers, non-Welsh speakers, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, those born outside of Wales, etc. So it's absolutely key that this is something that everyone feels they have a stake in, not a small group of us who might have engaged with this process. And crucially, obviously, we cannot leave out our young voters, those between 16 and 18 and 16 to 25. They, after all, are our future, and more than ever, I think their voices we need to make sure that they are heard. There'll be a need to identify the following and tailor the messages accordingly. What is people's sort of pain? What do they worry about? And what preoccupies them? What gives them pleasure? What are their values? How do we make this report something that's relevant to them and that they can see is basically something that is exciting and worthwhile sort of pursuing? The message must be one of hope, and we really hope that the contents of this report will inspire people with that feeling of hope. Gan droi wedyn at ymgysylltu, sef yr rhan arall o gyfathrebu felly. Mae'r rhaid i negeseuon yr ymgysylltu drin a thrafod a newid a bod yn barod i ymateb i sefyllfaoedd gwahanol ar hyd yr amser. We must basically continue to adapt and evolve messages. There are a vast number of areas and sectors with whom we may engage, including national bodies with extensive memberships, and it's going to be crucial that we do engage with those people. We've got third sector membership organisations such as Wales Cooperative Centre, WCVA, Community Development Wales, Mudiad Ysgolion Meithrin, Young Farmers Clubs and so forth. We've got colleges and universities. We've got federations of businesses, including those that represent business interests, community and town councils, local authorities, sports associations, Welsh language groups, cultural sector groups. The list goes on, doesn't it? But it's very important that these all get engaged. Allwn ni ddim gweld sut mae'r adroddiad yma mynd i gyrraedd pobl heb i ni fod yn ymgysylltu hefo'r mudiadau yma I gyd, heb enwi gormod ohonyn nhw felly. We've also thought that engagements could take many forms. For example, we could hold, well, especially in this pandemic period, online conventions via Zoom so that people can discuss themes that are very important to them. And we think, you know, having sort of read this report very carefully, some of these questions are things that should be discussed and engaged on. How could an independent Wales meet the needs and priorities of the people of Wales? How could we be better and more sustainable and have a healthier population as a result of independence? And clearly, the need to improve the economy and have better job opportunities is going to be key. And Rhys again has touched a great deal on that. There's obviously the context here as well. We cannot ignore Brexit, and we shouldn't. We cannot ignore the effects of COVID-19 on our well-being and our economy. We must also obviously acknowledge that climate change is a growing issue and must be absolutely addressed in the context of what this report has to say. We also need to think, obviously, about what success stories we can talk about. What's already happening here that makes it a possibility that we could build on those successes and make it even more attractive if we had an independent Wales. We also think the sector champions are going to be key here to represent and to be the ambassadors of the stories in this report. We cannot do this on our own. We have to work collectively, and I can see that it might be sensible to have possibly 100 key individuals that could be appointed ambassadors to undertake this engagement role. When we're allowed to come together in more than groups of 6, I'm hoping there will be the possibility of holding some events and mini festivals as well. That seems a very distant prospect at the moment, but obviously that's something that we must engage in and make sure that the content of this report gets discussed at appropriate festivals. And let's not forget the absolute importance of social media and short films and so forth as well to convey these messages. So, in a nutshell, if we manage to adopt this active engagement and communication strategy that I've just outlined in brief to you, I'm sure that we will be able to bring Wales with us. Mi fyddwn ni'n gallu dod â Chymru gyda ni. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Fflur. Gai ddiolch o galon i'm hyd Comisiynwyr Rhys, Fflur a pob un arall o'r Comisiynwyr dwi wedi enwi am roi o'i hamser a'i gwybodaeth a'i medrusrwydd dros y 9-10 mis diwethaf yma. It's been a great privilege to work with all the commissioners over the last 9 or 10 months who've given of their time and expertise to draft this particular report, which, as Fflur says, is now going to engender a deep and sensible conversation about the way forward in the future. The report has been published by Llwyd. There is a Welsh language version and an English language version. It will be available from the publisher, and as they say, from all good booksellers, but also it will be free to download from the Independence Commission's website, in both languages, obviously. Gai ddiolch o galon i chi am wrando, ag gobeithio yn y misoedd a'r blynyddoedd i ddod gawn ni ddwysau y drafodaeth bwysig hon. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.